No, I can't skip it, but I don't think this is on there. Two overall contexts have an influence on international negotiation. Now you're negotiating internationally. You have an environmental context and an immediate context. Environmental includes forces that neither negotiate or control that influence the negotiation. Immediate are factors over which negotiators appear to have some level of control. So that's environmental versus immediate. Environment you don't control, immediate you do. So environmental, the context of environmental, are things like political and legal pluralism. You don't control the political situation in the country where you are negotiating. You do not have control. So differences of taxes, labor codes, contract law, and enforcement. You don't control those. Those are environmental. International economics, currency differences, fluctuations, and stability. If you're negotiating price, you do not control currency differences between your country and the country where you're negotiating. Foreign governments, government regulations of industry, organizations and political impact. You don't control that, but it can have an impact on your negotiations. So these are things that impact your negotiations that you don't control. Instability, lack of resources, shortages of goods or services, political instability in some countries. Ideology, individual rights versus group rights. Earning and sharing profits, public versus private investment. Culture, people from different cultures negotiate differently. And external stakeholders, those who have a stake in negotiation outcomes such as labor unions, business associations, and customers. All of those are environmentally context to negotiations. Things that impact the negotiation process, but things neither party have control over. They are beyond your control. Immediate are what you do control. So, relative bargaining power, access to markets, distribution systems, and managing your relationship with government agencies. Conflict. High conflict based on ethnicity, identity, or geography are more difficult to resolve, but you do have some control over that. Relationship between negotiators. So the relationship prior to negotiations will definitely impact the process and outcome of those negotiations. So if you go into international negotiations and you have established a good working relationship, chances are your negotiation will be very positive. Desired outcomes, tangible and intangible factors. Countries use international negotiations to achieve both domestic and international political goals. And immediate stakeholders include negotiators themselves and the people they represent, such as managers, employers, boards of directors, each with influence over the negotiation process. Those are all immediate contexts. The influence of culture on negotiation. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of culture. So, research suggests that culture has an effect on negotiation outcomes, although it may not be direct, and it likely has an influence through differences in the negotiation process in different cultures. Some evidence suggests that when you do cross-cultural negotiations, they may actually yield poorer outcomes than intracultural negotiations. Now, remember I said before, it has gotten to a point now, if I'm negotiating something for my company in Japan, it may make more sense for me to hire someone in Japan who is familiar with the culture to act on my behalf in those negotiations rather than send someone from the US to Japan who is not familiar with the culture. Does that make sense? So, intracultural negotiations usually going to be more successful. Research also finds that negotiations conducted in individualistic cultures, such as the United States, are less likely to have an integrative win-win outcome as those conducted in collectivist cultures, such as Japan. So, Japan is much more collective, okay? Actually, so is the Middle East. You have a very collective culture. You more family relationships, group relationships, you have a common religious bond, and so on. Whereas in the United States, you don't have that. It's more individually driven. You don't have the family bond. You don't have a one religion bond. It's more individualistic driven. Make sense? Just so you know the difference between individual culture versus collectivist culture. And Japan is very collectivist. Okay. Influence of culture on negotiation. The negotiation process itself. So culture has been found to have significant impacts or effects on the negotiation process, including how you plan for the negotiation, the offers made during negotiation, the communication process, and how information is shared during negotiation. Culture plays a lot of, has a lot of influence on that in the negotiation process. Culturally responsive negotiation strategy. So when choosing a strategy, negotiators should be aware of their culture and the other party's culture. Very important to know your, well, there's an old saying, know your enemy, okay, or know your opponent. Where'd that come from? Know your enemy. Art of War? I think so. Understand the specific factors in the current relationship and predict or try to influence the other party's approach. So, when choosing a strategy, negotiators should ensure that strategies are arranged based on the level of familiarity, low, moderate, or high, that a negotiator has with the other party's culture. So looking at that, by the way, this is not on your exam, this chapter. Low cultural familiarity. Employ agents or advisors, like sending somebody to Japan. Useful for negotiators who have little awareness of the other party's culture. So you have an intermediary negotiate for you who is familiar with the other culture. That's called the unilateral strategy. A joint strategy is to bring in a mediator that encourages one side or the other to adapt to one's culture approaches, or mediator culture approach. The other one is induce the other party to use your approach. That's the joint strategy. So the other party may become irritated or be insulted. So if I'm a negotiator from the US and I go to the Japanese party that I'm negotiating with and say, you know what, why don't we use my cultural approach rather than the Japanese approach? Are they going to be insulted? Probably. Yeah. Yeah. Because that's very unfeeling. Okay. The medium cultural familiarity. Adapt to the other negotiator's approach. Involves making conscious changes to your approach so it is more appealing to the other party, or you can coordinate adjustment, meaning it involves both parties making mutual adjustments to find a common ground in the negotiation. So if you have cultural differences, you try to meet common ground needs so that you can have more commonalities. Okay. And last but not least, the high cultural familiarity. Embrace the other negotiator's approach, adapting completely the approach of the other negotiator. The negotiator then needs to completely bilingual and bicultural. Very difficult. Improvise. Craft an approach that is specifically tailored to the negotiation situation, the other party, and the circumstances involved. So that way, you are customizing every cross-cultural negotiation to meet the individual needs of your opponent. That's a lot of, all of these are, this is a lot of work to do. All they have something called the effect symphony, which is a joint strategy. The parties create a new approach that may include aspects of either home culture or adapt practices from a third culture. That's called effect symphony. It's basically, we'll blend our culture and have a completely different negotiation that is not based on either one of our cultures. We'll actually adopt a third culture. Not a good solution. And that's it on culture. Wow.